The night was still. The city streets were quieter now, bathed in the cold glow of neon lights. Marcus Carter sat in his black Lexus, parked outside a corner coffee shop, just trying to unwind after a long day. But tonight, fate had other plans. A white police officer, Officer Mark Davis, eyes the car from across the street, his suspicion rising with every passing second. As he approaches, his steps heavy with authority, something feels off. He knocks on the window, too hard, too sudden. Marcus looks up, and in that moment, everything changes. The officer, though, doesn't know that the man he's about to confront isn't just anyone. Marcus Carter is the man who saved his son's life years ago. This isn't just a stop, it's a reckoning waiting to unfold. Marcus Carter sat in the driver's seat of his black Lexus, parked on the familiar street outside a small coffee shop. The neon lights flickered softly, reflecting off the wet pavement after a light rain. It was 8:45 p.m., still early enough that the streets weren't deserted, but quiet enough for him to enjoy some solitude. Marcus was just a man enjoying a quiet evening, a rare break from his high-stakes job as deputy director of the FBI. He didn't need the badge or the uniform here. Tonight, he was simply a man who needed coffee. But peace was hard to come by. Not far from him, Officer Mark Davis, a patrol officer in his 40s, had his eyes fixed on Marcus's car. Davis had a reputation for profiling, and seeing a black man in an expensive SUV was enough to spark his suspicion. He sauntered over to Marcus's car, his steps purposeful and filled with judgment. Without warning, he knocked sharply on the window. Marcus blinked in surprise, but quickly regained his composure. He rolled the window down slowly. "Can I help you, officer?" Marcus asked, his tone calm but sharp. Davis leaned in, glaring. "Show your papers now," he demanded, his voice low but commanding, not even offering the courtesy of an explanation. Marcus's stomach tightened. He had been here before. The tension between Officer Mark Davis and Marcus grew by the second. Davis, clearly irritated, stepped back from the window but didn't let up. He crossed his arms and glared down at Marcus. There was something in the way his eyes narrowed, a certain assumption that Marcus was guilty of something just because of the car he drove and the color of his skin. "Just because you drive a car like that doesn't mean you're above the law," Davis sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "I know your type, always acting innocent, but you're just waiting to do something illegal, aren't you?" Marcus felt his pulse quicken, the weight of the officer's judgment settling on him like a heavy blanket. The injustice of it all wasn't new, but the way Davis was looking at him, like he was already guilty without cause, cut deeper than usual. His calm, practiced exterior barely held up against the rising frustration inside him. "I'm parked legally," Marcus replied evenly, his voice unwavering. "I didn't break any laws. I'm just here for coffee." Davis ignored him, his focus on the Lexus, as though the car itself was a sign of wrongdoing. "Yeah, you really think you can park here like you own the place? Maybe you're here waiting for a deal to go down. Or maybe you're just trying to be fancy with your shiny ride." His tone became more sarcastic with each word, as if mocking Marcus for simply existing in this space. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to stay composed. He knew that any quick movements could be used against him. His hand hovered near the door handle, ready to get out if necessary, but not wanting to escalate things further. Davis was testing him, trying to provoke a reaction. But Marcus wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. "I'm not waiting for anyone, and I'm not doing anything wrong," Marcus said slowly, his voice low but firm. "If you want to check my car, go ahead. But you need to stop accusing me." The officer stepped closer, looming over Marcus's window. "Oh, so now you think you can tell me what to do?" Davis's voice grew louder, more aggressive. "I've been on this beat for years. I know what's going on around here. People like you, driving fancy cars at night, they're always up to no good." The words stung, sharper than Marcus expected. "People like me?" he repeated, his voice rising just slightly. He could feel the anger bubbling under his skin, but he forced himself to remain calm. "What do you mean by that?" Davis leaned down, his face inches from Marcus's. "You know exactly what I mean," he growled. "You think I'm stupid? You think just because you've got a badge somewhere, it means you get special treatment?" His voice was thick with scorn, and Marcus could see the way his hands tightened at his sides. "I'm not asking for special treatment," Marcus replied, his voice steady but his body tense. "I'm just asking you to do your job and stop making assumptions." Davis didn't take kindly to being challenged. He barked, "I don't have to take orders from you, and I don't care who you are. I can arrest you right here for being rude to an officer." He grabbed Marcus's driver's license from his hand, snatching it away without a second glance. He held it up as if it were evidence of a crime rather than just a piece of identification. Marcus's fingers tightened around the steering wheel as the officer threw his driver's license back into his lap. He could feel the officer's eyes burning into him, the silent accusation hanging in the air. It was as if Davis had already made up his mind, his entire demeanor filled with suspicion and hostility. "What's your problem, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice sharp with frustration. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm just trying to get a coffee." Davis smirked, looking down at Marcus with disdain. "Oh, I've been around long enough to know when someone's lying. I've dealt with your type before. You think I'm just going to let you off because you think you're above this? Think again." Marcus's eyes narrowed, but he didn't flinch. The officer's hostility was clear, and he could feel the power shift. Davis was trying to get a rise out of him, but Marcus wasn't going to give in. "Not yet. You want to check my car, officer? Go ahead. But if you don't have a good reason to keep me here, I'll be on my way," Marcus said firmly, his patience beginning to wear thin. Davis's face twisted in irritation. "You think you can walk away whenever you want? I'm the one in charge here. You don't get to tell me what to do." Marcus felt the situation teetering on the edge, knowing that every word, every movement, could either escalate or de-escalate what was becoming a tense, high-risk encounter. The tension between Officer Mark Davis and Marcus had escalated quickly. The officer's body language, tight and aggressive, stood in stark contrast to Marcus's calm demeanor, but both men could feel the situation growing more dangerous with every passing second. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, and Marcus could sense the officer was no longer simply doing his job. He was fighting for control. Davis, his hands still resting on his hips, eyed Marcus with growing disdain. "I've been around long enough to know when someone's hiding something," he said, his voice laced with suspicion. "People like you think you can just park here, all fancy with your shiny car, and not raise a few eyebrows?" Marcus's blood boiled. "You don't know anything about me," he replied firmly, trying to keep his voice even. But the sting of the officer's words cut through him. The insinuations, the judgment, were too familiar, too tired. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. It was about something deeper, something rooted in a system that still saw him as an outsider, no matter his accomplishments or status. "You think you're above it all, don't you?" Davis's words were sharp, his eyes narrowing with every word. "You think you can park here like you're too good to be questioned?" "No," Marcus answered, his voice low but filled with authority. "I'm simply parked in a legal spot, trying to get coffee." But Davis wasn't listening. He took a step closer, leaning down toward the open window, his breath heavy with frustration. "I know your type. Expensive car, out late at night, pretending to be innocent. But I've seen enough of your kind to know better." Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. "I've had enough of this," he muttered under his breath, trying to suppress the anger that was now bubbling to the surface. Davis took a step back, seemingly waiting for Marcus to react. When Marcus didn't, Davis sneered. "You're probably just waiting for someone, aren't you?" he continued, his voice rising with each accusation. "Waiting to make a deal, or maybe you're just here to sell something. You think I'm not watching? I know exactly what you're up to." Marcus inhaled deeply. He had faced worse, much worse, in his career. But this was a different kind of indignity. It wasn't just about a misunderstanding. It was about a deep-rooted bias that Davis didn't even bother to hide. "You don't know anything about me," Marcus repeated, his voice cold and steady. "But if you think you can just keep me here without cause, I'm leaving." The officer's eyes flared with anger at the suggestion. "You don't get to tell me what to do, all right? I have the right to detain you, and right now, that's what I'm going to do." Davis moved in, his hand hovering near his belt as he loomed over Marcus, the tension growing thicker between them. Marcus felt the temperature of the situation rising. He knew that this was a dangerous moment, but he didn't dare show fear. One wrong move, and it could all escalate. "You want to detain me?" he asked, his voice quieter now, but with an undeniable edge. "You need to have a reason for that, or I'm leaving." Davis's lips curled into a bitter smile. "A reason? I don't need a reason for you," he spat. "You're guilty the moment I lay eyes on you. Now get out of the car." Marcus felt his chest tighten as Davis pulled the door handle, yanking the door open roughly. "Get out," Davis ordered again, his grip firm on the handle. The moment hung heavy in the air. Marcus knew he had to comply, or things could get even worse. His breath caught for just a moment, and then, with a steadying exhale, he unbuckled his seatbelt. He didn't make any sudden movements, didn't give Davis any excuse to act out. Slowly, he slid out of the car, his body tense as the officer reached out to grab him. "Hands behind your back," Davis barked, spinning Marcus around. Before Marcus could react, Davis jerked his arm behind him and clicked the handcuffs into place. Marcus winced at the pressure on his wrists, the cold metal digging into his skin. But the pain was nothing compared to the humiliation he felt. He had been in dangerous situations before, faced criminals who could hurt him physically, but nothing compared to the feeling of being treated like this by someone who wore a badge. The system, it seemed, was still just as broken as ever. "I haven't done anything wrong," Marcus protested, struggling to free his arm, but Davis was relentless. "I don't care what you say," Davis sneered. "You should have known better than to challenge me." Marcus's heart pounded, but he refused to let Davis see his fear. He had faced much worse in his career. But this was something else. This was a direct affront to his dignity, his very humanity. The tension in the air was suffocating as Marcus stood, handcuffed and facing the officer whose grip was steadily tightening around his wrist. Every movement he made was calculated, as he knew one false step could make the situation spiral out of control. His heart raced in his chest, but he forced himself to remain composed, knowing that his calm was the only thing keeping this from escalating further. Officer Mark Davis wasn't backing down. He had already made his mind up, and in his eyes, Marcus was guilty. The assumption, the prejudice, it was all too clear. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Davis sneered as he pulled Marcus's arm behind his back, twisting it until it hurt. Marcus grimaced, but he didn't let the officer see his discomfort. He had dealt with physical confrontations before, but this felt different. This wasn't just a conflict over authority. This was a man who had been consumed by his biases, using his power to break another person down. The sound of the cuffs clicking into place echoed in Marcus's mind like a death knell. "You're overreacting," Marcus said, his voice quiet but firm. "You don't need to do this." He tried to steady his breathing, knowing that any sudden move could give Davis the excuse he was looking for to justify even more force. Davis was undeterred. "Shut up," he spat, his face twisted in contempt. "You think you can talk to me like that? You're not above the law." He tightened his grip, causing Marcus's shoulder to burn with the pressure. "Let go of me," Marcus ordered, his jaw set in determination. "I didn't do anything wrong. You're violating my rights." But Davis wasn't listening. He was too consumed by his own sense of authority, too blinded by his assumptions to care about Marcus's innocence. He shoved Marcus roughly against the side of the car, forcing him to stumble forward. The cold metal of the vehicle pressed into his chest, the air knocked out of him for a moment. The pain in Marcus's wrists flared as Davis continued to hold him in place, the handcuffs digging deeper into his skin. It was more than just physical discomfort. It was the humiliation, the complete disregard for his dignity that stung the most. He had been in life-threatening situations before, but never had he felt so powerless, so completely dehumanized. Davis leaned in closer, his breath hot on Marcus's neck. "You should have known better than to question me," he growled. "I don't have to take your crap. You think just because you're a big shot with the FBI, you're above the law? Not here, not now." Marcus's jaw tightened. He had dealt with men like Davis before, men who abused their power, men who thought their badge gave them the right to treat others like dirt. But it didn't make it any easier. The weight of Davis's arrogance, his belief that he could get away with this, was crushing. "You've got no idea who you're messing with," Marcus said through clenched teeth, trying to control the fire burning inside him. "You're making a mistake." Davis laughed bitterly, a sound that made Marcus's skin crawl. "A mistake? You're the one who made a mistake by not listening." He shoved Marcus harder against the car, the force causing Marcus to stumble slightly, his body bracing against the car's hard edge. "I've been through worse than this," Marcus said, his voice quieter now, but with an edge that could not be ignored. "But this is something else. You're abusing your power, and you're going to pay for it." But Davis wasn't listening. He continued to press Marcus, the officer's body weight pressing him further into the vehicle. "Oh, I'm the one who's going to pay," Davis sneered. "You really think you can talk to me like that?" "I'm not scared of you," Marcus shot back, his voice steady despite the rage that boiled beneath the surface. "You don't have control here, Davis. I'm not the criminal. You are." Davis's grip on Marcus's arm tightened, and in that moment, Marcus knew something had to give. The situation was spiraling out of control, and he could feel it in the officer's movements. Every shift of his weight, every twist of his arm was a step towards something much worse. "You better watch your mouth," Davis warned, his voice lowering to a threatening growl. But Marcus wasn't about to back down. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface was now bubbling over, and he wasn't going to let Davis treat him like this any longer. "Take your hands off me now," Marcus said, his voice commanding and unwavering. It was the final warning. He wasn't going to let the officer push him any further. The moment Lieutenant Robert Sanders arrived at the scene, everything changed. His gaze locked onto Marcus's face, and it only took a second for recognition to hit him like a wave. Sanders took a step forward, his eyes widening. "Wait, no," he muttered, his voice full of disbelief. "Marcus Carter?" Davis froze, his entire body going rigid. He had been so caught up in his own anger and assumptions, so certain of his judgment, that he hadn't bothered to notice who Marcus was. "What?" Davis asked, his voice laced with confusion. "What are you talking about?" "Marcus Carter," Sanders repeated, now more urgently. "Deputy Director of the FBI. Do you know who this is?" He looked at Davis, his voice tinged with disappointment. Davis's face drained of color. He stepped back, a sinking feeling in his stomach as he realized the enormity of his mistake. Marcus Carter, the man he had just wrongfully handcuffed, accused, and treated with contempt, was one of the highest-ranking officials in law enforcement. Davis's breath caught in his throat. The weight of the realization hit him harder than anything else could. Marcus, still handcuffed, stood there with quiet authority, but inside he was seething. He had endured this type of injustice before, racial profiling, assumptions, and stereotyping, but the anger he felt now was different. This time, the truth had been revealed in a way that couldn't be ignored. "You didn't know?" Marcus said coldly, his voice cutting through the thick tension. "No, you didn't. You didn't take the time to even check my identity, did you? You just assumed that because I'm black and I'm driving a nice car, I'm somehow guilty." Davis couldn't meet his eyes. His hands were shaking, and he felt a deep, suffocating shame. The power he had felt moments before, the control he thought he had, was slipping through his fingers. He had made a mistake, a catastrophic one. I didn't know," Davis stammered. "I didn't realize who you were. I'm sorry." Marcus didn't flinch, didn't react. He simply stood there, unyielding, letting the silence hang in the air. The words from Davis felt like an empty apology. Marcus didn't need an apology, he needed action. He needed people like Davis to understand the damage they caused with their blind assumptions and prejudice. Sanders, seeing the devastation on Davis's face, turned to him, his voice rising with frustration. "Do you realize what you've done? You just handcuffed one of the most respected men in law enforcement, a man who has saved countless lives, a man who saved your son's life." Davis's breath caught in his throat at those words. His mind scrambled, and for a brief moment, he felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him. Marcus Carter, the man he had just humiliated, had saved his son's life years ago. He remembered it now, the memory of the accident, the frantic hospital visit, and the man who had been there, pulling his son from the wreckage, doing everything to keep him alive. Davis's face turned pale as realization dawned. You saved my son," he whispered, his voice full of disbelief and guilt. I didn't know." Marcus stared at him, his face expressionless, but the weight of the truth hung heavy in the air. "You didn't know, but you assumed," he said, his voice low but full of power. "And now you'll have to live with the consequences." As Sanders moved to release the handcuffs, Davis remained frozen in place, his world unraveling before his eyes. The truth had been revealed, and there was no escaping it. The damage was done. The consequences would follow. The truth hit Officer Mark Davis like a ton of bricks, and for the first time in his life, he felt completely powerless. His legs weakened beneath him, and his once steady hands shook uncontrollably. The man he had just humiliated, the man he had assumed was a criminal, was someone who had not only earned a distinguished position in law enforcement, but had also saved his own son's life years ago. The realization sank in deeply, the weight of it dragging him down with the force of a tidal wave. Marcus stood before him, calm and collected, his handcuffs finally removed by Lieutenant Robert Sanders, who now stood between the two men, his face a mixture of disbelief and disappointment. Marcus didn't say a word, his silence a damning accusation, and Davis was left to confront the wreckage of his actions. "I didn't know," Davis repeated almost to himself, as if saying the words could somehow make it all go away. But deep down, he knew there was no going back. His mind was spinning, desperately trying to justify his actions, but it was too late. The truth had already been revealed, and it was far more damning than he had ever anticipated. Sanders, his voice cold but laced with an edge of authority, spoke up. "Davis, do you have any idea what you've just done? This isn't just a screw-up. This is a complete violation of everything you've sworn to protect. You just disrespected one of the most respected men in law enforcement, someone who has saved lives, including your own sons. And now look at you." Davis swallowed hard, his throat dry. He tried to muster some kind of defense, but the words didn't come. His chest tightened, and he felt like he might collapse right there. His career, his entire sense of self, was crumbling before him, and he couldn't escape it. It wasn't just the mistake he had made in handcuffing Marcus. It was everything that led up to it. The assumptions, the biases, the deep-seated prejudice that had clouded his judgment for so long. It all came rushing to the surface now, and Davis was left to face the ugly truth about himself. I didn't mean to," his voice trailed off, the words getting lost in the weight of his regret. The apology felt empty, hollow, because he knew it couldn't undo what had been done. He had abused his power, and in doing so he had shown the world, especially Marcus, that the very system he was supposed to uphold was broken. Marcus's eyes, steady and piercing, never left him. "You didn't mean to?" he repeated quietly, his voice low and full of authority. "It's not enough, Davis. You don't get to not mean to when you've stripped someone of their dignity. You don't get to hide behind ignorance when you've abused your position of power." Davis's heart pounded in his chest. The reality of his actions was crashing down on him, and he could feel his confidence, once so unshakable, disintegrating. His whole life, he had worn his badge with pride, believing that it made him better, more righteous than others. But now, he was nothing more than a man who had failed, and the realization of it was unbearable. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," Davis said, his voice breaking as the tears welled up. He had never been one to show weakness, but now, as he knelt before Marcus, his hands trembling, the truth was undeniable. I didn't know it was you. I didn't realize who you were, and now, I've ruined everything." Marcus didn't offer him sympathy. He didn't offer forgiveness. He simply watched him, his expression cold but not without understanding. He knew the damage had been done, and words couldn't undo that. "I don't want your apology, Davis," Marcus said firmly. "What you did goes beyond just a simple mistake. You can't just walk away from this. You need to understand that this isn't just about me. It's about the system that allowed this to happen in the first place. And it's time for that system to change." Davis remained kneeling, his face flushed with the humiliation of it all. His tears weren't just for the mistake he had made, they were for the truth he had been blind to for so long. He had spent his life believing that his badge made him untouchable, but now, in front of the very man he had wronged, he saw how fragile that power truly was. "Please, I can't lose everything," Davis whispered, his voice raw with desperation. "I have a family. I can't lose my job." But Marcus, standing tall, simply turned his back on him. "This isn't about you," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years of injustice. "It's about change, and you have to face the consequences of your actions. There's no going back from this." As Marcus walked away, leaving Davis kneeling on the pavement, the officer knew, deep down, that he had lost everything. His career, his pride, and the very trust he had in the system he swore to protect. It was all gone, and there was nothing left for him now but to confront the consequences of his own choices. In the distance, Sanders looked back at Davis, a mix of anger and pity in his eyes. "You've done it now, Davis," he said quietly. "You've got no one to blame but yourself." And with that, he walked away, leaving Davis alone with his guilt and his broken pride. Within hours of the incident, the situation began to take on a life of its own. News outlets picked up the story, and social media exploded. Videos of Officer Mark Davis handcuffing Marcus Carter in the street, his accusations and subsequent humiliation, spread like wildfire. What had been a routine traffic stop had turned into a public spectacle, one that would cost Davis everything. On the streets, people had gathered, some watching in silence, others filming the entire exchange. The viral videos showed a man in uniform abusing his power, a black man being treated like a criminal for no reason other than his race. The public outrage was immediate, and soon, the hashtags began trending. #Justice for Marcus, #Abuse of Power, and #End Racism in Policing. In one particularly powerful video, a bystander had captured Davis yelling at Marcus, while the camera zoomed in on Marcus Carter's calm face, an expression of quiet defiance amidst the chaos. It was this stark contrast that caught people's attention. The serene dignity of the man in handcuffs, who had saved countless lives, compared to the brash aggression of an officer too blind to see beyond his prejudices. Within hours, the viral footage caught the attention of major news networks, and it wasn't long before interviews and op-eds were demanding answers. National outrage was sparked. In small towns and big cities, people gathered in protest. Marches, petitions, and calls for accountability erupted across the country. In the newsroom, reporters tried to process the story as it unfolded. The news anchors were still trying to wrap their minds around the details. In a shocking turn of events, an officer has been caught on video humiliating one of the most powerful figures in law enforcement, Marcus Carter, Deputy Director of the FBI, the anchor said with a tone of disbelief. The officer, Mark Davis, failed to check Marcus's identification before escalating the situation. Marcus Carter was illegally detained and handcuffed in front of a crowd. And as we now know, Marcus had previously saved the officer's son during a life-threatening accident years ago. At the same time, Davis's name was plastered across every news source, with many outlets calling for his immediate suspension. Online, people were digging into his past. It didn't take long for a series of complaints about his previous actions to surface. Allegations of racial profiling, abuse of power, and excessive use of force. The evidence was there, and it was damning. In the midst of the online fury, Davis's life, once full of certainty, began to unravel. He had been a pillar of his community, proud of his badge and the authority it carried. But now, he was nothing more than a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. Marcus, on the other hand, became a symbol of resilience and dignity. People rallied behind him, not just for the injustice he had faced, but for the strength with which he had handled the entire situation. He had not given in to the officer's aggression, nor had he allowed his own anger to get the best of him. Instead, he had faced it all with quiet power, unbroken by the abuse. His story was picked up by activists, politicians, and human rights organizations. They were calling for Davis to be held accountable and for the systemic issues within law enforcement to be addressed. It wasn't just about one bad officer anymore. It was about an entire system that allowed this kind of abuse to happen unchecked. Marcus's voice, once that of a respected law enforcement official, now became a rallying cry for change. At home, Marcus watched the news with a quiet resolve. His phone rang constantly, calls from colleagues, friends, and strangers offering support. The messages were filled with gratitude, admiration, and apologies. But for Marcus, it was not enough. This was not a moment for sympathy. It was a moment for action. It was clear to him now that the fight was just beginning. Meanwhile, Davis remained in a state of shock, unable to process the storm of events he had caused. He had spent the last several years of his life believing that his badge made him infallible, that his authority was absolute. But now, as he watched the videos online, as the public outcry grew louder, he realized that his entire life had been built on a lie. The support he once had, his fellow officers, the community, was now gone. He had betrayed it all, and there was no way to undo the damage. As the days passed, Marcus's lawyer began preparing for what was to come. The public pressure was mounting, and Davis would soon face the full consequences of his actions. The investigation into his conduct had already begun, but for Marcus Carter, the damage was more profound than what any investigation could fix. His trust in the system was gone, replaced with a resolve to make sure this never happened again. The public reaction was clear. This was more than just a mistake. It was a wake-up call for a society that had long ignored the abuses of power. And it was a call to action for everyone who believed in justice, fairness, and equality. The fight had only just begun. The next few hours unfolded with the kind of tension only reserved for moments of irreversible change. As the evening news continued to cover the unfolding scandal, Officer Mark Davis's world crumbled further. His name was plastered on every major network, along with videos of him abusing his authority, humiliating Marcus Carter, and subsequently becoming the face of the public's outrage. What had been a single moment of poor judgment had spiraled into a full-blown crisis, and there was no escaping the consequences. Inside his home, Davis sat on his couch, his head in his hands, unable to process the reality of what had happened. The weight of it all, the media frenzy, the protests, the outrage, crushed him. The phone rang incessantly, but he couldn't bring himself to answer. Every time he looked at the screen, his heart dropped. The calls were from his fellow officers, from his family, from the community he had once been a respected part of. But now none of it seemed to matter. He had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. Meanwhile, Marcus Carter sat in his living room, the TV showing a split screen of Davis's sobbing apology and the images of public outcry. His phone had been buzzing all night, messages from colleagues, friends, even strangers. Everyone wanted to know how he was feeling, what he planned to do next. Yet, despite the overwhelming support, Marcus felt numb. This wasn't about him anymore. This was bigger. The system had failed him and so many others like him, and it wasn't enough to simply apologize. "I never wanted any of this," Marcus muttered under his breath, staring at the screen. He had hoped that his career in law enforcement would allow him to make a real difference, but now, it was clear that the fight was far from over. His decision to stay calm, to not lash out, to simply stand tall, those choices now symbolized something greater than just one man's dignity. But the truth was undeniable. The abuse of power had to stop. In the following days, the consequences for Davis began to materialize. The police department, once a place he had proudly served, had launched an internal investigation into his actions. His colleagues, once his trusted partners, now viewed him with suspicion and disgust. The department's leadership, shaken by the public outcry, quickly suspended him pending the investigation. Davis, who had once walked the streets with pride in his badge, now faced the very system he had spent years supporting. He had become a pariah, an example of what happens when authority is abused. "I don't know how you could do this, Mark," Officer Sanders said, his voice flat during one of the few conversations they'd had since the incident. Sanders had always admired Davis, but now there was only disappointment in his eyes. "I thought you were better than this. You had everything: respect, a career, a future, and you threw it away." Davis sat silently, unable to respond. The words seemed to fall heavy in the air, but nothing could break the silence between them. He had thrown it all away in one reckless moment, and now he had nothing left to hold on to. Meanwhile, the public response intensified. Protests continued to swell in the streets, not just in Marcus Carter's defense, but for the countless other victims of police brutality who had been overlooked for so long. Social media was flooded with images of Davis's face, his name becoming synonymous with misconduct. The hashtag #EndRacismInPolicing was trending nationwide, and politicians, activists, and everyday citizens alike were calling for systemic reform. For Marcus, this was the moment he had feared but also hoped for. He had worked tirelessly to dismantle the systems of oppression in law enforcement, but now, the reality of what needed to change was undeniable. As the calls for justice grew louder, he found himself in the spotlight, not as a victim, but as a symbol of the necessary change. However, Marcus's newfound role in the fight for justice didn't come without its own challenges. He faced resistance from within his own department. Many colleagues were unwilling to believe the depth of the problem, or were afraid of the repercussions if they spoke out. But Marcus couldn't back down. "I didn't ask for this role," he told a group of young officers during a meeting, his voice steady. "But this is what we're up against. If we don't make change, nothing will ever get better." As the investigation into Davis's actions continued, the public demanded more than just an apology. They demanded action. They wanted accountability. Davis would soon face formal hearings, where the consequences of his actions would be laid bare for all to see. And as the days turned into weeks, the ripple effects of that one moment continued to spread. The truth had been revealed, and there was no turning back for Mark Davis. His life, his career, his reputation, everything he had built, was gone, shattered by his own hand. For Marcus Carter, the road ahead was still uncertain, but the fight for justice, for equality, and for the very soul of law enforcement had just begun. The consequences were just beginning, and they would be felt for a long time. As the weeks passed, Mark Davis found himself in a prison of his own making. He had been suspended from the force, and was awaiting the formal hearings that would determine his future. The walls of his home felt closer with every passing day, each room filled with the weight of his guilt. He had lost everything: his career, his dignity, the respect of his colleagues, and most painfully, his sense of self. Every time he looked in the mirror, the face that stared back was unrecognizable. He couldn't escape the image of Marcus Carter, standing calmly, handcuffed, as the world watched him. That image haunted him, the realization that he had not just wronged a man, but a symbol of justice itself. On the other side of the city, Marcus Carter sat in his office late one evening, watching the news. The stories had become a constant reminder of the storm his life had become. The protests had slowed, but the calls for reform had only intensified. He had become a face for the fight against systemic racism in law enforcement. His phone buzzed constantly with messages of support, but also of criticism. Some saw him as a hero, others as a target. Yet, amidst it all, he remained focused, determined that his work was far from over. Marcus reflected on the night everything had changed. His actions had been deliberate, calm, calculated, and firm in his belief that he could make a difference. He had stayed composed, even when Davis was at his most aggressive. But he knew that his actions were part of something bigger, a movement that was about more than one incident. It was about the future. It was about the change that had to happen. The truth had been revealed, but it was only the beginning. The battle for justice, for equality, and for fairness was far from over. One evening, Marcus sat down with a group of young officers in a small meeting room. They were nervous, unsure of where to begin, their eyes shifting from Marcus to one another. He spoke quietly but with authority, his words steady and clear. "You're part of something much bigger than yourselves," Marcus said, looking at each of them with deep sincerity. "This isn't just about being good at your job. It's about understanding the responsibility that comes with wearing that badge. It's about making sure that justice isn't just a concept. It's a reality for everyone, not just the people you choose to protect." The officers nodded, some with hesitant expressions, others with a glimmer of understanding. For Marcus, the fight was as much about changing minds as it was about changing laws. And while the road ahead would be long, he knew that it had to begin with individuals. People who could see past the surface, beyond the prejudices that clouded judgment, and truly see one another for who they were. As for Davis, he sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the paperwork in front of him. His trial loomed on the horizon, and he couldn't help but think back to the day it all began. He remembered the confidence he had felt, the way he had believed that he could do no wrong. But the truth, as it always does, had exposed him. There was no escaping it now. The question that haunted him every night was whether there was redemption. Could he make it right? Or had he crossed a line that could never be undone? The night before his trial, Davis made a decision. He sat down at his desk, writing a letter to Marcus Carter, one that he knew he owed him, not just for his actions, but for his own understanding of the depth of the mistake he had made. The words didn't come easily, but they were honest. "Marcus," he began, his hand shaking slightly, "I can never undo what I did. I know that, but I need you to know how deeply sorry I am. I failed you in a way that I cannot fix, but I am committed to learning, to changing, and to using my experience to prevent this from ever happening again." It was a small gesture, but for Davis, it was the first step in a long road of redemption. Whether it was enough, only time would tell. As the trial approached, Marcus received news that the case against Davis had been formally opened. It would be a long process, filled with legal battles and more public scrutiny. But for Marcus, this wasn't just about the trial. It was about something bigger. The opportunity to shape a future where incidents like this didn't just result in consequences for the individual, but for the system as a whole. The final message was clear: change was possible. But it required everyone, officers, citizens, leaders, and even those like Davis, who had to confront their own mistakes, to take responsibility. Marcus knew this wasn't just his fight, it was all of theirs. The truth had been revealed, and with it came the responsibility to act. For Davis, the journey to redemption was only just beginning. But for Marcus, the fight for justice had only intensified, and he would never stop pushing for the change that was so desperately needed. The reflection was painful, but it was also a call to action for everyone involved, for a future where equality and fairness were no longer just ideals, but reality. The story of Officer Mark Davis and Marcus Carter is not just a tale of conflict between two individuals. It's a reflection of the systemic issues that continue to plague law enforcement and society. At its core, it teaches us a valuable lesson about the dangers of prejudice and the abuse of power, and the long road to redemption. Davis, once a respected officer, thought his badge gave him the right to act without consequence. His encounter with Marcus, an upstanding man who had earned his place as deputy director of the FBI, revealed the deep flaws in his thinking. Instead of seeing Marcus for who he truly was, Davis saw him as an easy target, a black man in an expensive car, a person to be judged by the color of his skin and the car he drove, not by his character or the life he had led. When the truth was revealed, Marcus had once saved Davis's own son's life. It was a brutal awakening for Davis. The crushing weight of his own ignorance and arrogance became clear. He had just wronged the very man who had given his son a second chance at life. That realization shattered him. But the damage had already been done, and the consequences were inevitable. His career was on the line, his reputation in tatters, and his own soul deeply scarred by the weight of his actions. The true lesson here lies in the path Davis must now take. Redemption is not something easily granted. It is earned. Through reflection, action, and the willingness to confront one's own mistakes, true change can begin. However, It is also a reminder that the damage done by one person's assumptions can affect many others, and it takes more than just an apology to mend the harm caused by systemic issues. For Marcus, this was not just about seeking personal justice. It was about sparking a larger conversation about the need for change within law enforcement. His calm demeanor in the face of adversity, his refusal to let the situation escalate further, showed a remarkable strength. He stood firm, not just for himself, but for countless others who face similar injustices every day. Ultimately, this story reminds us that justice is not a simple, isolated event. It is a continuous journey. For Davis, the road to redemption will be long and painful, but it is one that he must walk alone, facing the consequences of his actions. For Marcus, the fight for justice will continue, a reminder to all that even in the face of adversity, change is possible if we are willing to stand up for what is right. The lesson here is clear. Only through understanding, self-reflection, and a commitment to fairness can we begin to rebuild trust and create a future where justice truly applies to all. After watching the powerful story of Officer Mark Davis and Marcus Carter, we can't help but ask, how do you think a single act of prejudice can ripple through an entire life, affecting not only the victim but also the one who caused the harm? What steps can we, as a society, take to ensure that true justice is served, not just in the courts, but in our everyday actions and assumptions? Share your thoughts below. Let's discuss how we can all contribute to meaningful change and create a more just world for everyone.